Good evening. My name is Peter Meehan, and I'm the President and Vice Chancellor of St. Jerome's University, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome you once again to the lectures, clearly our most popular of the lectures in Catholic Experience for the 2024-25 season. We will begin with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge with respect that St. Jerome's University and the University of Waterloo reside and operate on the traditional territory of the Attawandaron, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. Our university is situated on the Haldeman Tract, the land that Frederick Haldeman granted to the Haudenosaunee of the Six Nations of the Grand River in 1784, and that includes 10 kilometers on both sides of the Grand River and extends from its source to Lake Erie. We give thanks for the privilege to work and live on this land, and we are committed to building respectful relationships with Indigenous people and communities to enhance our knowledge and to learn how we can have an active role in reconciliation. A little background about this series. Since 1982, St. Jerome's University has offered lectures in Catholic Experience to our local community, providing opportunities for us to engage with the critical issues of our time. We've invited scholars, activists, experts, and religious leaders to address subjects including religion and politics, spirituality, ecology, responsible government, religious pluralism, ecumenism, interfaith dialogue, religion, and the media. This year's theme for the lectures, Solidarity in a Time of Solitudes, brings together a series of talks by academics and practitioners who help us to understand the potential for solidarity in a time of solitudes. Our speakers this year have challenged us to think about religion of the heart that may not appear in a church pew, remind us of the potential for sport to bridge difference, surprise us with the potential of interfaith dialogue on university campuses, inform our understanding of religion and political polarization, speak to the past, present, and future of a synodal church, and emphasize our collective obligation to people on the margins. This evening's talk is entitled Cherished Belonging, the Healing Power of Love in Divided Times. For our guest this evening, cherished belonging is the central theme of his life and ministry. It explains what he has learned, practiced, and taught through his Jesuit vocation, that there is a deep connectedness and belonging to others, regardless of their backgrounds, flaws, and often horrific life circumstances and choices. The concept of cherished belonging marks our guest, along with his confrere Pope Francis, among the most prophetic voices of our times, offering a powerful message of compassion and love in response to the division and negativity in our world, and as a way to heal and transform individuals and communities. As I read his thoughts and reflections, I hear the answer to the perennial question that should be in the minds of all Christians: what would Jesus do? A bit about our speaker now. Father Gregory Boyle is a Jesuit priest and a native of Los Angeles, California. From 1986 to 1992, he served as pastor of the Dolores Mission Church in Boyle Heights, then the poorest Catholic parish in Los Angeles, that also had the highest concentration of gang activity in the city. Father Boyle witnessed the devastating impact of gang violence on his community during the so-called Decade of Death that began in the late 1980s and peaked at 1,000 gang-related killings in 1992. In response, he and members of his parish and the greater community adopted what was a radical approach at the time: to treat gang members as human beings. In 1988, they started what would eventually become Homeboy Industries, which employs and trains former gang members in a range of social enterprises, as well as providing critical services to thousands of men and women who walk through its doors every year in search of a better life. Father Boyle is the author of the 2010 New York Times bestseller, Tattoos on the Heart, The Power of Boundless Compassion, and also Barking to the Choir, The Power of Radical Kinship in 2017, and most recently, Cherished Belonging, The Healing Power of Love in Divided Times. In 2014, He was named by President Barack Obama as a champion of change. And in 2017, he was given the University of Notre Dame's Laetare Medal, which is the oldest honor given to an American Catholic. Last year, a week after I reached out to him to come to St. Jerome's, it was announced by U.S. President Joseph R. Biden that Father Boyle was to receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor awarded in the United States of America. Please join me in welcoming our guest, Father Gregory Boyle.
Thank you, Peter, for that kind introduction. First of all, let me just apologize for my country. We're not well. Sorry. So it's a privilege to be here. And thank you for inviting me. Anytime I'm ever standing in front of a microphone, I always think of this homie named Luis Perez, who a gang member and helped run Homeboy for like 10 years. And he was a shot caller from his gang, and he was in prison, and it was a heroin addict, and then was in recovery, and a force of nature, really. And he... When I couldn't give a talk, I would send him to give a talk, and he really liked doing it. And one night, the two of us just went out to dinner, and he was giving me tips on how to speak publicly. And he said, you gotta pepper your talk with self-defecating humor. And I said, yeah, no shit. That is some good advice there. So brace yourselves. You come to a thing like this at night, and it always makes me think of Martin Luther King, what he said about church, that it's not the place you've come to, it's the place you go from, which could well be said of students here at St. Jerome's. It was always going to be the place you go from, but same thing for this talk tonight. And we go from here to imagine a circle of compassion, and then imagine nobody standing outside that circle. You go from here to dismantle the barriers that exclude. I have to say that I spent the most amazing several hours with the people from the Working Center, and I was so moved by them and how powerful their presence is in announcing what kind of God we have. And I won't forget having been with you this morning. But that's exactly what you do for a living. The people at the Working Center have stood at the margins knowing that the only way to erase them is to stand out at them. And that's how you end up creating a community of kinship such that God, in fact, might recognize it. And there's a particularity to that invitation, which is to stand with the poor and the powerless and the voiceless, and to stand with those whose dignity has been denied, and to stand with those whose burdens are more than they can bear. And every once in a while, and I know the folks at the Working Center have this palpable sense of this, that you feel this extraordinary privilege in all its exquisite mutuality to be able to stand with the easily despised and the readily left out, to get to stand with the demonized so that the demonizing will stop, and with the disposable so that the day will come when we stop throwing people away. And you brace yourselves when you go to the margins. because the world will accuse you of wasting your time there. But the prophet Jeremiah writes, "For in this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing." And you go to the margins and other voices get heard. So I don't know. I think none of that makes any damn sense at all unless you're kind of anchored in a sense of God that's spacious. Otherwise, it doesn't work. You know, we've settled for a partial God, and our God gets kind of tiny. Meister Eckhart, a mystic and a theologian, used to say, "It is a lie, any talk of God that doesn't comfort you." And we don't really actually believe that. Like, we don't think that's part of God's agenda for us. My friend Mirabai Starr, and I really recommend her books to you. She's a magnificent person, but a great writer. And she says, once you know the God of love, you fire all the other gods, which I think is a good task of maturing spirituality. I had a spiritual director many, many years ago. He said to me, "You know, we need a better God than the one we have." He was a Jesuit. But of course it's true. We do need a better one because we've settled for this tiny one. And, you know, we project onto God, all our stuff. Richard Rohr says, yeah, it's true that we're created in the image and likeness of God, but it's equally true that our image of God creates us. And so we want to kind of get beyond that. Anne Lamott says, you know you've created God in your own image when God hates the same people you do, you know? So we don't want to fall for that. So, you know, for 40 years I've walked with gang members, and the day won't ever come when I have more courage or I am more noble or I'm closer to God than the thousands and thousands of gang members I've been privileged to know. Part of, in the last 40 years, you know, we have a lot of detention facilities in Los Angeles County, what you would call a region. And I would say masses at all these places, juvenile halls and detention camps and probation camps and all sorts of facilities. And once I was at San Fernando Juvenile Hall, and it was a gym with 300 gang members in it, and so I had my Albon and my stole, and I was sitting, we were on a little raised thing like this, and I was sitting in my chair over there, and they had these sheets that had the readings in English and in Spanish, and so you could follow along. And you know, when you preside, any priest here, sometimes you close the thing and you go, I'm going to close my eyes and I'm going to hear the word proclaimed. You do that, you know. And so the homies came up to do the readings, and the guy did the first reading from the Old Testament, and the second guy got up to do the responsorial psalm. And I don't know, there was just like an overabundance of confidence in his voice. And he gets up and he says, "The Lord is exhausted." And I said, what the hell? And it was, "The Lord is exalted." And I remember thinking at the time, wow, that's way better. Because the exalted God is the one that, you know, we would want if we were God, let's face it. But the exhausted God, you can connect to it, you know, at your most generous. You know, maybe in this crowd, grandparents who have grandchildren over for the weekend, and someone says, "How was your weekend?" "Oh my God, I'm pooped." You know, I had the grandkids over, you know, but it's a good tired. You know exactly what I'm talking about. That the exhaustion somehow connects to the generosity of the God we actually have. And we want to hold out for the God we actually have. We don't want to settle for a partial one. You know, I guess one of the benefits of COVID was, the discovery of Zoom. And I have 5 sisters and 2 brothers. And so we get together once a month on Zoom. And they're all married, so it's a lot of people. And we did not that long ago, and it was the anniversary of my mom's death. And my father died like almost 30 years ago now. But my mom died, this is my marker, somewhere in the beginning of the first Trump presidency. I'm embarrassed that that's a marker. I can't remember what year it was, but somewhere right there, Anyway, she was 92 years old when she died, and she died the way, you want to die. In your own bed, in your own home, surrounded by your kids. That's how she died. And she was sharp as a tack till the very end. And she wasn't a lick afraid of dying. In fact, a month before she died, she was just giddy. She was just so excited. And she goes, "I've never done this before." Which is something you say exactly before skydiving, and in fact, the day before she died, I was, sitting at the foot of her bed, and I was all alone in her room. This absolutely never happened. There were always people in and out and lots of people sitting in there. And she was asleep, and she woke up, and she saw me sitting there at the foot of her bed, and she went, "Oh, for crying out loud," and she went back to sleep. Well, she was pissed that she hadn't died yet, and I'm sorry. And then the next day, I was sitting there again at the foot of her bed, and this was so strange to have 2 days in a row where nobody was in there. And exactly noon, she opened her eyes, and she lifted her head from the pillow, and she let out this glorious, wondrous gasp, skydiving, and she left us. And nobody in earshot of that sound could ever be afraid of death again. But I remember that in her last days, she'd be in and out of consciousness, and there'd be 2 or 3 or all 8 of her kids and grandkids around her bed. And she'd be in and out, and when she would come into consciousness, she'd lock onto just one of us. She always did this. And she would look at this one person with laser beam focus, and she would look at them with breathless delight, and she'd say, "You're here, you're here." And I remembered that when we buried her, and I thought, this may well be the singular agenda of our exhausted God, is to look at you with breathless delight and say, "You're here, you're here." In fact, we just finished Easter, Lent, which was, 40 days, 40 nights, came from Jesus in the desert. And I can never mention the word Lent without telling you about Michelle Nunez, who was a homegirl who worked at Homeboy Industries. And once she came into my office, she says, "Well, it's official. I just found out my man's been cheating on me." And I said, "Oh my gosh, I'm sorry." "Nah, don't sweat it. I just went to church, got me them ashes, gave his ass up for Lent." That has nothing to do with what I'm talking about, but I'm like Pavlov's dog. I can't hear the word Lent and then not tell you about Michelle Nunez. But anyway, so there's Jesus in the desert, and we have this notion, that he's grumbling stomach and dark night of the soul, maybe in doubts. And when I suspect it was probably mainly God looking at Jesus and saying with breathless delight, "You're here. You're here." And Jesus probably saying back, "You're here." And so I think that's how it works. You know, we receive the tender glance, then we choose to be that tender glance in the world. We notice the notice of God, and then we choose to be that notice. I had a homie who ended an email, early morning email to me not long ago, and his last line was, "Today I will choose to surrender into the arms of God, then choose to be those arms." And I think that's exactly how this is supposed to work. And then and only then can you choose to take seriously what Jesus took seriously, which happens to be four things, which happens to be what the Working Center does for a living: inclusion, nonviolence, unconditional loving kindness, and compassionate acceptance. So this talk is not the place you've come to, it's always going to be the place you go from to take those things seriously and to receive the tender glance and then to become that glance in the world. So as Peter mentioned, Homeboy Industries was started a long time ago, 1988, when I was pastor of the poorest parish in the city, Dolores Mission. It was nestled in the middle of two public housing projects, Pico Gardens and Aliso Village. At the time, it was the largest grouping of public housing west of the Mississippi. We had 8 gangs at war with each other, which is unheard of in public housing to have that many. And that led the LAPD to call my parish the place of the highest concentration of gang activity in the whole city. So there are 120,000 gang members in LA County and 1,100 gangs. And if LA is the gang capital of the world, my parish was the gang capital of the city. So I buried my first young person killed because of this sadness in 1988. And 2 months ago, I buried my 263rd. Not all from that community, but I know a lot of gang members and I get asked. So the first thing we did was we started a school because there were so many junior high, middle school age gang members who had gotten the boot from their home school. Nobody wanted them. So they were wreaking havoc in the projects in the middle of the day. They were writing on walls, they were selling drugs, they were violent. And so I remember walking out to where they kicked it, and I would kind of isolate them one at a time, and I'd say, "Hey, you know, if I found a school that would take you, would you go?" And to my surprise, each one said, "Yeah, I would." And then I couldn't find one that would take them, you know, so that kind of forced my hand a little bit. So across the street from the church is our parochial elementary school, grades K to 8, Dolores Mission School, that occupied the first 2 floors of this concrete block building. Well, the entire 3rd floor was the convent. And so one night I gathered all the nuns, there were about 8 of them, and sat them down in their living room and said, "Hey, you know, would you guys mind, you know, moving out? And we could turn the convent into a school for gang members." And they looked at each other and they went, "Sure." And that was the entirety and the extent of their discernment process. And so we were off and running, and gang members from all 8 gangs came in large numbers to this school. And we probably had 3 or brawls a day. It was really intense. And I didn't have teachers last, and I had a principal last exactly one day. And I called him the next day to see where the hell he was, and he had changed his number and apparently checked into a witness protection program. But they came. That was so extraordinary. And before too much time that they were there, they started to say, if only we had jobs. So myself and the women in the parish, and the profile of folks who lived in the parish were women with children. There weren't a lot of men. And so myself and the women in the parish, we marched around the factories that surrounded the housing projects, trying to find felony-friendly employers, you know. And we handed out this flyer that said, Jobs for a Future, which was the name of our organization initially. And so it wasn't so forthcoming that people would hire them. So we started stuff, a maintenance crew, a landscaping crew, a crew to build our child care center, all made up of members of the rival 8 gangs in the projects in my parish. And then the last day of April of 1992, after the acquittal of the 4 police officers who beat down Rodney King, every pocket of poverty in Los Angeles just ignited, except the poorest pocket, my parish. And so the LA Times came and they wanted to know why that was. And I said, well, I'm not entirely sure, but I think part of it was, you know, we had 60 strategically hired rival enemy gang members who had a reason to get up in the morning and a reason not to gangbang the night before, and more to the point of your question, a reason not to torch their own community. And so the article appeared the next day. Well, the following day, I was summoned to the Beverly Hills office of a movie producer named Ray Stark, who happened to have $500 million. And so he asked me, how should I spend my money? And as I look back on it now, I can see that I woefully undershot my request. I was young. I had hair. I said, well, there's an abandoned bakery across the street from our school. You could buy it. It has ovens. They don't work, but you could fix them. I don't know. We could put hairnets on rival enemy gang members. They could bake bread, and we could call it Homeboy Bakery. I mean, that was the extent of my business plan. And he said, sure. So we were off and running again, you know, and then a month later, we started Homeboy Tortillas in the Grand Central Market in downtown LA. Once we had plural, we changed our name from Jobs for a Future to Homeboy Industries, as if there was any industry involved in any of this, you know. We were talking at the working center. Not everything worked, you know. Like Homeboy Plumbing was not hugely successful. You know, who knew? People didn't want gang members in their homes. I did not see that coming. And nobody ever plans to do such a thing. You know, you don't really kind of are ever thinking like, you know, 10 years from now it'll look like this. But we've backed our way now into, we evolved in such a way to become the largest gang intervention rehab reentry program on the planet. So we get 10,000 folks a year who walk through our doors wanting to reimagine their lives. And we want to create a place that's safe, where they are seen, and then they can be cherished. If it's true, as I think it is, that the traumatized are likely to cause trauma, then it has to be equally true that the cherished will be able to find their way to the joy there is in cherishing themselves and others. Everybody who walks through our doors comes barricaded behind a wall of shame and disgrace. And the only thing that can scale that wall is tenderness, which is the highest form of spiritual maturity. Everyone who walks through those doors comes with what psychologists would call a disorganized attachment. Mom was either frightened or frightening. And you can't calm yourself down if you've never been soothed. And you receive the tender glance, and then you soothe people. Because we think we're a bunch of tribes where people hold certain views, but in the end, we all just are held by an anguish which calls for a soothing that can only happen in community. So everybody who walks through our doors, and our place is not for those who need help, it's only for those who want it. You have to actually walk through the doors. But once they do, it's like red carpet and ticker tape parade, and people greet you and look you in the eye and say, "You're here. You're here." And they say it with breathless delight. At Homeboy, though, we're kind of allergic to the idea of holding the bar up and asking homies to measure up, because our exhausted God doesn't do that. So why would we? Instead, we hold the mirror up and we tell people the truth, that they're exactly what God had in mind when God made them. And then you watch folks for whom that message is foreign. You watch them inhabit that truth. They become that truth. And no bullet can pierce it. No 4 prison walls can keep it out. And death can't touch it because it's huge. But you have to reach in and you have to dismantle the messages of shame and disgrace that get in the way, that keep people from seeing their truth. Parentheses. So I'm a Jesuit, but the homies don't really know what a Jesuit is, you know? Although we've always had like 3 of us working there. Right now we have Frank and Mark, who are both therapists, but they don't really know what a Jesuit is. And so one day I was sitting in my office, and behind my office is glass enclosed, so I can see the whole reception area. I can see the front door when people choose to walk in. And I was sitting behind my desk, and I had 2 homies in front of my desk, and we were talking. And we have like 8 tour groups a day from all over the world. And the tours are run by homies. And so as I'm talking to these 2 homies, this big group of like 20 people just plant themselves in front of my office. And it's one of those observe our founder in his natural habitat kinds of moments. And so the guy giving the tour, the homie, is Osvaldo, and he has what the homies would call a loud-ass voice. And he says, "This is Father Greg Boyle. He is the founder of Homeboy Industries. He is a jiu-jitsu priest." So from my office, I do some of my clearly more impressive moves, you know. Well, I told you that to tell you this, that on February 28th, 1540, St. Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits, enters for the first time in his spiritual journal, diary, this one word. And then he uses it a fair amount of times for the remaining 12 years of his life. And before he died, he went back and he circled the word for all the times he used it. Now, I speak Spanish, but I'd never heard this word before. And the word is acatamiento. Acatamiento. And it comes from the word acatar, which means to look at something with attention. And it gets translated as affectionate awe. And as soon as I heard that particular translation, it called to mind a line in the Acts of the Apostles, where it says simply, "And awe came upon everyone." And it seems to suggest that the measure of health in any community at all, including this one, may well reside in our ability to stand in awe at what the poor have to carry, rather than stand in judgment at how they carry it. Acatamiento, affectionate awe. And though clearly it was born from Ignatius's own singular mystical moment between him and the God of love, I'd like to think that he wants to suggest even to us today that it's a disposition at the margins. That when we go and stand there, our disposition is affectionate awe. It tells us how to stand there. So many years ago, we used to have these things called gang-in services. I'm not aware that they have them anymore, but especially during the decade of death, which was 88 to 98 in the United States anyway. And in Los Angeles, we had 1,000 gang-related homicides in 92. So it was really an intense time, morning, noon, and night shootings. So consequently, all over the country, they would have these gang-in services. And, so I was invited by 600 social workers in Richmond, Virginia, to participate in this. And, they commandeer a hotel ballroom, and they sign in, and they go from 9 to 5, and they get 3 credits if they go to this, and they have keynotes and workshops and breakout sessions. And the goal, of course, is, for folks who work with gangs, presumably to explain to them, why do kids join gangs, and how you talk about how gang violence is a lethal absence of hope. And no hopeful kid has ever joined a gang in the history of the world. And how no kid is seeking anything when he joins a gang. He's fleeing something. Things like that. So, what if we were to infuse hope to kids for whom hope is foreign? And what if we were to help heal damage? And what if we were to deliver mental health services in a timely and culturally appropriate way? So I'd done a lot of these in those days and figured I'd do a keynote or something. And so I said yes, and I bought my plane ticket. Well, a week before I was to fly, this is my bad habit, I'll pull out the letter. What am I doing in Richmond, Virginia? And to my horror, I discovered that I was to be the only speaker 9 to 5 all damn day. And as the homies often say, oh, hell no, I'm not going to be the only speaker. So I called in 2 trainees, and part of our program is an 18-month trainee program. We have 500 trainees. So I call in Andre, who's an African-American gang member, and his enemy, Jose. And I sit him down in my office, and I said, look, at the end of the week, you're flying with me to Richmond, Virginia. I'd like you to get up in front of 600 social workers and tell your stories. Take your time. Because we got a long-ass day to fill. Well, I'd never heard their stories, and Jose gets up first, and I guess he was like 25 years old. And, shot caller from his gang on the streets, been to prison, tattooed. At that juncture, in his 9th month with us, he kind of glommed on to the substance use disorder team, a man solid in his own recovery and now he's helping younger homies and homegirls with their addiction issues. So not only was he gang member on the streets, prisoner, he had a long stretch as a homeless man, even longer stretch as a heroin addict. And so he gets up first in Richmond, Virginia, and he begins. I guess you could say my mom and me, we didn't get along so good. I think I was 6 when she looked at me and she said, "Why don't you just kill yourself? You're such a burden to me." Well, 600 social workers audibly gasp. And then he says, "It sounds way worser in Spanish." You know? And I'd never seen this. We went from gasp to laugh. It was like whiplash. And then he continued, "I think I was 9 when my mom drove me down to the deepest part of Baja California, and she walks me up to an orphanage, and she knocks on the door, and a guy comes to the door, and she says, 'I found this kid.' And she left me there for 90 days till my grandmother could get out of her where she had dumped me, and my grandmother rescued me. My mom beat me every single day of my elementary school years with things you could imagine and a lot of things you couldn't. Every day, my back was bloodied and scarred. In fact, I had to wear 3 t-shirts to school each day. First t-shirt because the blood would seep through, and second t-shirt, you could still see it. Finally, the third t-shirt, you couldn't see any blood. Kids at school, they'd make fun of me. "Hey, fool, it's 100 degrees. Why are you wearing 3 t-shirts?" And then he stopped speaking, so overwhelmed with emotion. And he seemed to be staring at a piece of his story that only he could see. And when he could regain his speech, he said through his tears, "I wore 3 t-shirts well into my adult years because I was ashamed of my wounds. I didn't want anybody to see them. But now I welcome my wounds. I run my fingers over my scars. My wounds are my friends. After all, how can I help heal the wounded if I don't welcome my own wounds?" And awe came upon everyone. Acatamiento, affectionate awe. The measure of our compassion lies not in our service of those on the margins, but only in our willingness to see ourselves in kinship with them. For the truth of the matter is this: if we don't welcome our own wounds, we may well be tempted to despise the wounded. I'm going to tell one last story, and then, and so get your question and answers together if you've got any, and we'll do it kind of the old-fashioned way. You go like this, I'll call on you like that. You don't have to move, just shout it out. I'll repeat your question. So I was heartened to hear earlier at the reception that folks, like there's, a book club or gathering where you were reading some of my books. And it happens, a fair amount usually at jiu-jitsu universities where they, force their students to read my books against their will. And I'm not complaining, but so Gonzaga University in Spokane, my alma mater, forced their incoming freshmen to read Tattoos on the Heart. And so they said, could you come and speak? And they'd have a Tuesday night, huge venue with 1,000 people. And they said, could you bring 2 homies with you? And I generally do if people ask. And I always pick homies in almost always the same way. I always pick enemies, rival gang members, just to force them to share a hotel room just to mess with them. And I always pick homies who have never flown before because just for the thrill, of seeing gang members panicked in the sky. And I remember I was at LAX airport and I had 2 homies and one of them says, "Hey, G, are we flying Virgin Airlines because it's our first time?" I said, "Yes, it's a requirement. We'll be coming home on American." So I picked 2 homies, Larry, an African-American gang member, and his enemy, Mario. And, lately I've had so many trips all over the place. And so I'm used to nervous Nellies, but nothing prepared me for this guy, Mario. He was just in Spanish, we would say paniqueado. He was so terrified. It was starting to freak me out a little bit. He was hyperventilating, which I had never witnessed. It was like, like that, and we hadn't even, boarded the plane yet. And so we were at Burbank Airport, which is a smallish airport, but big airplanes, Southwest Airlines mainly, and big planes. But you don't, board the plane by getting on that hermetically sealed chute thing to get on the plane. You walk out on the tarmac like you're the president, and they have steps leading to the front of the plane. Big feature, and Burbank, you have steps leading to the back of the plane. So it's early morning, and Larry's investigating the airport or something, and I'm sitting there with Mario. And it's the first flight of the day. So it's early morning, and I see our flight crew arrives, and there are 2 female flight attendants. Both of them have very large cups of Starbucks coffee, and they're schlepping up the steps of the front of the plane to board it. And just then Mario goes, "When are we going to board the plane?" And I said, "Well, as soon as they sober up the pilots." There they go now. Perhaps I shouldn't have said that. But I should tell you that in our 37-year history as an organization, Mario's the most tattooed individual who's ever worked there, which is saying a lot, trust me. He's all sleeved out, all to his fingertips with tattoos. Neck blackened with the name of his gang. Head shaved, covered in tattoos, forehead, cheeks, chin. Eyelids that say "the end," so that apparently, when he's lying in his coffin, there will be no doubt for anybody, I guess. So I'd never been in public with him. So I'm walking him through the airport, and people are, "Oh my God," like this. And mothers are clutching their kids closely to themselves. And I think, wow, if you were to go to Homeboy tomorrow and walk up to anybody who works there and just say, "Who's the kindest, most gentle soul who works here?" they would wait exactly a beat, and then they'd say, "Mario." Yeah, Mario. Mario is proof that only the soul that ventilates the world with tenderness has any chance of changing the world. He is proof, as George Saunders says, that the only non-delusional response to everything is kindness. So we get to Gonzaga. Big talk Tuesday night, 1,000 people. But what they don't tell you is, we'd like you to visit 95 classrooms before the talk tonight. I go, oh my God. So I tell these guys, you get up, tell your stories. I'm going to be sitting in the back of the classroom. And so they got up. Mario in particular was quite terrified, but they did a good job. Stories of terror and torture and violence. abuse of every imaginable kind. And honest to God, if their stories had been flames, you'd have to keep your distance. Otherwise, you'd get scorched. I would not have survived a single day of either of their childhoods. So we get to the big venue, and there are 1,000 people, and so I coax these guys to get up before me and do 7 minutes each, just like they had done in that classroom. And then they stepped down, and I got up and I did my thing, and then question and answer time. So I had them stand on either side of me, and it was 1,000 people, but yes, ma'am. And a woman stands and she goes, yeah, I got a question. It's for Mario. First question out the gate. And Mario's kind of a tall, skinny drink of water, and he steps and clutches the microphone, and he's just terrified. He says, yes. And she says, well, Mario, you say you're a father. You have a son, a daughter. They're about to reach their teenage years. What wisdom do you impart to them? You know, what advice do you give them? And Mario closes his eyes and he clutches the microphone with great intensity, and he's starting to tremble, and he's getting a friggin' hernia trying to come up with whatever the hell he's going to say, when suddenly he blurts out, As soon as he says those two words, he rushes back to his microphone-clutching, closed-eyed refuge. And now I know he's losing the battle with his tears. But he wants to get the whole sentence out. I just don't want my kids to turn out to be like me. And there's silence until the woman who asked the question stands, and now it's her turn to cry. Why wouldn't you want your kids to turn out to be like you? You are loving, you are kind, you are gentle, you are wise. I hope your kids turn out to be like you. And 1,000 total perfect strangers stand, and they will not stop clapping. And all Mario can do is hold his face in his hands, so overwhelmed that this room full of strangers had returned him to himself. But let there be no mistake, everybody standing had been returned to themselves. And I think that's the only praise our exhausted God has any interest in. So this talk is not the place you've come to. It was always going to be the place you go from. Reminding each other as we walk each other home to health and wholeness, that we receive the tender glance and then we become that tender glance. We receive and notice the notice of God and choose to be that notice in the world. We decide to surrender into the arms of God and then choose to be those arms. And my sense of this community already is that you gave up a long time ago caring if anyone accuses you of wasting your time at the margins. For in this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks. We'll just do a few questions because it's past my bedtime, but I don't know about the rest of you. And we'll try some old school, go like this and go like that. And if you're meek and mild, I'm going to go ahead and repeat the question. Or comment or denunciation or... Yes.
Father, you get support from either government sources or city sources in terms of running your program?
Yeah, so the question is about, do we get support? Or kind of a different model there, And so although we've never really gotten much government funding, either federal or state or county or city, those are the four streams. So we're low, like maybe 15%. I've neglected to say that we have 14 social enterprises, a bakery, restaurants. We just added dog grooming, which we call puppy fades. Nobody consults me anymore, but electronic recycling, Homeboy silkscreen, so 14 of them. And we have a $50 million annual operation. So the businesses bring in about $10 million. We have good friends, and people have kind of stood by us for 37 years. But it's always, you spend $50 million, and then you have to raise $50 million. I mean, it's really daunting. So that's always a challenge. And I was saying to the working center people that, the first 10 years were really marked by so much hostility because the demonizing of gang members was writ large. And so the friend of our enemy is our enemy, And it was just a short hop to demonize me for helping gang members. So first 10 years were death threats, bomb threats, hate mail. And then it all changed, People kind of recognized that the choice was not soft on crime or tough on crime, but really smart on crime or tough. And then people started to embrace smart. So, we've kind of enjoyed support in the last many years. We initially were, because homies said, if only we had jobs. And so our T-shirts said, nothing stops a bullet like a job. And that's because we listened to gang members and they told us that. But once we knew gang members, we knew, oh no, an educated gang member may or may not go back to prison, or an employed one may or may not. But then it became our absolute contention, has been for the last 25 years, that a healed gang member will not reoffend, period. And we've kind of stayed with that, and that's always seemed to be true. So healing is the number one thing, and that happens in the culture, in the community. I was reading a New York Times editorial saying, we're teaching the wrong things in school. We need to teach resilience. And I was taking notes today with the working center folks, because it's just exactly right. What happens is, people become resilient. Resilience is a byproduct of having been cherished in community. And so it's not a curricular thing, It's, if people are cherished, they will become resilient. And systems change when people change, and people change when they're cherished. So I'm glad we made that shift, because initially we were kind of like a taxi dispatcher. Hey, they're hiring over there, go. Hey, this is not a job, this is a career, go. But there had been no healing. And so, we had countless examples of homies, their lady leaves them and throws a monkey wrench into their emotional life. And next thing you know, they're doing 125 years to life at Folsom Prison. So we kind of said, no, there's something, and that came from knowing gang members, not just listening to them. So, see how you ask one question, it leads to a long-ass answer? We'll only need 2 more. Yes, ma'am.
I was just wondering about your first point of contact with folks. Like, what are they coming in to ask for, and what do you do with them?
Okay, first contact with, and then I'll get you. First contact with, so in the old days, because I was in every single detention facility, I'd hand out my card. And, you know, so to this day, you know, gang members will come in covered in tattoos. Do you remember me? And of course I don't. And they say, well, you baptized me, you know, at Central Juvenile Hall. And this happens more often than you could imagine. And then he reaches into his pocket and he pulls out this old, yellowed, crinkly card that I must have handed him 20, 25 years ago. And he hands it to me and I go, wow, we haven't been at that address in really a long time. And I go to hand it back. This always happens. And he's got big tears in his eyes. And he says, I should have called you. You know, so a lot of prison time transpired, and it takes what it takes, you know, for a kid to turn his life around. In fact, I think I'm just going to tell one last story, and then, because we're pooped. But it takes what it takes. That triggered something for me. So I knew a homie named Danny, and I met him when he was 13. And, you know, I'd be on my beach cruiser in the projects in the middle of the night, put that Uzi down, are you sure you want to shoot that guy? That was my crazy life when I was pastor. But I saw him there, and once he had made a solemn vow, he said, I'm never going to step foot in Homeboy Industries. I go, So I knew him on the streets. And then I knew him in juvenile hall, and I knew him in probation camp. And then at 18, he went to prison for 2 years. And in recovery, you know, they'll say it takes what it takes. Gang recovery is the same. It can be the birth of a son, the death of a friend, a long stretch in prison. It takes what it takes. For Danny, he got out of prison to find that his mother had 6 months to live. She had pancreatic cancer. And I would watch him take care of her. And he had a lot of siblings, but he ended up being the hospice caregiver. So tender. All the more remarkable because she was torturous with him, actually. And I anointed her, and a week later she died. Week after that, I buried her. And a week after that, for the very first time, he walks into Homeboy Industries. And I watch him inhabit the truth of who he is. I watch him work side by side, making croissants in our bakery with a guy he used to shoot at. I used to watch him, he finally paid the bill. I watched him laugh from the stomach is the thing we always say at Homeboy. Anyway, one day he comes into my office and he was very dramatic. He sits down and he says, what happened to me yesterday has never happened to me in my life. And he tells me that across the street from our headquarters in Chinatown is the Chinatown stop on the train. And he gets in the train to go east. And he says that the train is packed, but he manages to get a seat. And standing in front of him, holding onto a pole, is, he says, a medio pedo guy, which means he's a little bit drunk. And he says that he's a gang member because he can see tattoos on his hand. And Danny's wearing a sweatshirt that says, Homeboy Industries, jobs, not jails. And the little bit drunk guy goes, "Hey, you work there?" And Danny just nods, not knowing whether he should really engage this guy. And then the guy says, "Is it any good?" And Danny shrugs and he says, "Well, it's helped me. In fact, I don't think I'm going to go back to prison because of this place." And then Danny stands up and he fishes out of his pocket a piece of paper, and he has a pen, and he carefully writes the address of Homeboy Industries on the piece of paper. And as he's telling me this, he says, "I couldn't believe I knew the address by heart." So he finishes and he hands it to the guy, and the guy studies it. And Danny looks at him and he sees him. And Danny says, "You come see us. We'll help you." And the guy sees Danny and he says, "Thank you." And the train stops and the guy gets off and Danny sits down. Now he returns to that earlier refrain. What happened to me next has never happened to me in my life. Everyone on the train was staring at me. Everyone on the train was nodding at me. Everyone on the train was smiling at me. And now he can barely speak. And for the first time in my life, I felt admired. And I remember the two of us, we just wept, because I don't know what you're supposed to do. And so you walk with people in the exquisite mutuality of kinship. It's not service provider, service recipient. It's connection, that you may be one, as Jesus puts it. And that's the hope. And then we each become delivery systems of hope for people for whom hope is foreign. And then we walk each other home to wholeness. Thank you all very much.
Is anyone else feeling some affectionate awe? Thank you, Father Greg Boyle. Please join me in giving me one additional round of applause for our speaker this evening. My name is Caroline McGregor. I'm the Vice President, Academic and Dean here at St. Jerome's, and it's my pleasure to end the night with just a few very quick notes of gratitude. First, I want to thank Norm at the Unmarketing Group, who provides our live stream and actually recorded tonight's lecture. So if you have a friend or colleague who couldn't attend tonight, we'll share that link on our website, and we hope that you'll continue to spread this good message. Nights like tonight are increasingly impossible without the support of generous donors. So we want to thank all of the folks who've contributed to St. Jerome's mission by sponsoring lectures like the one that we offered tonight. These events also don't just appear out of the ether. They're the work of many hands. So I want to thank Patience, Haley and Melissa from the advancement team, Courtney, who's been taking photos, our facilities team, and our photographer, Courtney, for all of their work in supporting of this event. St. Jerome's is really grateful to maybe be embedded in your memory of this evening as the place that you go from. So have a good evening, everyone. Thanks for being here.